Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody. This is Howard Fox for my co-host, Randy Ford. This is the Success Insight podcast. I hope you are having a great start to your week, and I am very happy to have back on the Success Insight podcast, Jim Moran. Jim is the president and founder of SimplifyISO.com. In fact, Jim was one of our first guests on a Success Insight podcast. And Jim, welcome to the podcast. Looking forward to chatting with you today about a subject that, you know, I think it's certainly near and dear to my heart, but I was actually curious through your expertise in the ISO environment, the ISO space, how the topic of leadership applies. So thank you for agreeing to come back on and chat with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Howard. As you know, my connection with ISO goes back to 1992. And it's when you use the term near and dear to your heart, it's been the main focus of my entire career for the last number of years and continues to be. It keeps growing. More new standards come out every day to help organizations manage themselves better. And the interesting thing about this topic of leadership, when you look at ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45000, well, I better tell what they are. When you look at ISO 9001, the quality standard, ISO 14001, the environmental standard, ISO 45001, the health and safety standard, ISO 50001, the energy standard, ISO 27001, the information security standard. Every single one of those standards, Howard, has leadership in the dead center of the diagram explaining what the standard or how the standard is put together. So leadership is honestly the foundation that all of these standards are based on.
You know, it's interesting as you kind of went right through that list, and also as your evolution into I think it's safe to say it, you're an expert on ISO and these international standards, and it's good to be an expert. What does leadership mean in the world of ISO standards, ISO certifications? What does it mean?
Well, that's a huge question, but I'll do the best I can. In order to get ISO certified, for those listeners who aren't ISO certified, the organization has to put together what's called a management system and then get certified to it. In order to get certified, a third party comes in and audits them against the requirements of the standards I just mentioned. But as far as leadership goes, leadership is responsible for planning. It guides, at least leadership should be guiding the planning. And that's a whole separate section called, no surprise, planning. And leadership also helps determine what the organization will have available for it in terms of resources, which is a whole nother section, section 7. It's called support, actually, but includes infrastructure, people, work environment, so on. But in order for an organization to get certified, leaders have to demonstrate leadership and commitment. They can't just be there with a nice suit on, men or women, either one. They have to demonstrate that they actually are committed to the quality management system or environmental management system or health and safety, whatever, by actually them personally taking accountability for the effectiveness of the system. And they have to make sure that they use or promote the use of the process approach, risk-based thinking. They need to provide resources. They need to communicate the importance of why they have this system and make sure that the system achieves its results. They even have to demonstrate that they are engaging, directing, and supporting people to contribute to the effectiveness of the quality management system. Included in that is them demonstrating that they are supporting other relevant management roles, so the other managers demonstrate leadership as well. So I'd have to say, I don't think I'd be overstating things if I said that leaders are the actual bedrock of a management system.
You know, it was interesting as you were laying the landscape out for how leadership applies within the ISO context. Is from my perspective as a coach working with business owners on leadership development, team development, I'm thinking about leadership behavior. And as you were laying out again this landscape for us, you were actually talking about the role of the leader or leaders and what they do or don't do in the planning, the communication, the organizing, creating processes for staff to follow. It's kind of I'm a little bit struck then in does it create any confusion for an organization that we are talking about people and their activities versus behaviors that they need to have in place to be thought of as a leader or a manager, a supervisor?
Well, I think all the work you do would clearly demonstrate that leaders have an impact on an organization. And the nice thing about any of these ISO standards is that an organization gets to write their own procedures. ISO standards, and there are 17,000 of them, ISO standards tell you what you need to do, but they don't tell you how you need to do it. So that's completely up to you. We refer to ISO standards as being descriptive, not prescriptive. So leaders would be free to behave any way they wanted to, just they have to demonstrate that they've met those requirements we just talked about. So any leadership style will get the results that style indicates. You've made a study of theory X, theory Y, theory Z, Ono's work, the management by objectives, all those different styles. But I think in your work, you'd also come down to the conclusion that it's all based on communication.
Right. Would an organization that is marketing and branding itself as an ISO certified organization versus one that did not, is it possible that they're also communicating to their, what I call ideal clients and customers, what their culture is like? Because if we adhere to ISO standards, it means we've got guidelines in place and processes, procedures, documentation of how managers need to interact with the staff and with their peers and with their customers, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
Would having these standards in place communicate that our culture is adhering to ISO, but also in the importance of what it means and how we run our business?
Yeah, I think that'd be a fair assumption to make, that anybody looking at 2 or 3 suppliers, if 2 of them were certified and 1 wasn't, they'd be kind of curious about what the 3rd supplier wasn't doing. That's the beauty of ISO. It's short form for the Greek word isos, which means equals. So they'd know that the 2 of the 3 companies had this leadership requirement met. Now, you wouldn't know how they met it, but you would know that a 3rd party looked at the leadership requirements and said, yes, these people are meeting all these 10 requirements. And in fact, it's funny we're talking about communication. In the one standard I mentioned, ISO 45001 health and safety, they have an additional 3 requirements for leadership that all include communication with workers.
That's very interesting, because it's so I can have my standard
Mhm.
and I can document that I have it. How I actually put it into practice, so what I say I do and how I do it can be two different things.
Yes.
And then as a company, I can look at, let's use the customer experience as an example.
Mhm.
If two companies are both saying they're ISO certified, I can look at, well, what are the public or what are employees saying about company A that's saying they're ISO certified versus company B. So I can use research that's available in the market to say this is a better company to work for because they take care of their employees, they're ISO certified, they take care of their employees, and they have a good reputation with their customer. So if there is an issue, they're on the spot, quick to help resolve it, prevent it from happening again, versus the company that just, yeah, they're ISO certified, but look at customer service, the customer experience,
Mhm.
there's issues here. Every time we go to call them, it's I have to spend a whole day solving a problem, and
Mhm.
it's frustrating.
That's a really interesting point. As the purchaser of the services from either of those companies, you could actually ask them, each of the two companies you're thinking about, ask each company to send you their procedures for how they handle customer complaints. And that way, as the purchaser of their services, or products, you'd be able to get a sense of what you're just talking about. You'd probably see a nice robust system in one and maybe not quite so much in the other. And you could even ask to see results, and you could even ask for referrals from to the customers, just like you would with any other service. If you were getting a body shop service from for your car, you might ask them to give you half a dozen names of people that had work done there. But that's probably been one of the I wouldn't say bone of contention, but the fact that a registrar, which is, by the way, sanctioned to do this work in the States by ANAB and in Canada by Standards Council Canada, like every country where ISO is implemented, and there are about 168 or something now. In each country, the national standards body for that country has given a business the accreditation to go do these audits. So that actually helps because they're third party, they're external, they don't have any affiliation with the company at all. But more back to your question, you couldn't make a decision, or you shouldn't make a decision just simply based on the fact that they have an ISO certificate. One thing that the ISO certificate has on it is what's called the scope. So you always need to check to make sure that the service or product you're purchasing from any particular company is in their scope of services. Like if you were buying a welding service, you'd want to make sure that the welding was on their scope. And you'd get in touch with them and say, can you tell me a little bit about the certification for your welders? That kind of thing. So as the purchaser of services or products from any company, you have every right to ask them for some details about their system. You probably wouldn't ask for a record of the management review, although it'd be a cool thing to do, but I've never heard of anybody doing it. But you would definitely want to see their corrective action procedure. What do they do when something goes wrong? And they may or may not be willing to share customer feedback with you, but they should at least be willing to share names of customers that you could use as a reference. Is that getting close to where you want to go?
I think it is, and from my perspective, so as a coach working with small business owners, I care about leadership. So it's more than just the title and wearing the suit and the tie, et cetera. And I was being sexist, and I apologize to our female leaders out there. But I'm
too.
Yeah, I'm thinking that leaders have to communicate. They need to be able to lay out, here is our vision, here's what the difference we want to make in the marketplace with our product or our service. We need to ensure that our employees have all the tools and the resources to be able to do their job as efficiently and as effectively and as error-free and in a safe, stress-free working environment as they can. And part of that is their ability to communicate down through the organization, especially down to the supervisor or manager and down to the rank and file, but also be willing to say and have a processor in place where if somebody that is down in the shop floor, for example, has a concern, that they feel safe in being able to bring it back up through the management chain. And there should be process procedures in place to do that. So if I have an organization that is ISO certified and I can look at their records or ask them for references, I can look at what does the market say about them, so I can do my Google searches, my Yelp searches, and look at and go on Glassdoor and look at their reputation, both from the employees and from and people that have worked for the organization. So it seems like ISO in the industries where it applies, that I can use it as a guidance, as a guideline to say, yes, an organization that is ISO certified, I can work with them to improve how their leaders are communicating through down into the organization. That's what I'm getting out of this conversation right now.
Yeah, I'd be willing to offer up for your consideration the idea that if a person like you could train leaders how to communicate better, I think they get a better value out of having their management system in place. And keep in mind, it costs a bit of money, sometimes a lot of money, to build the system in the first place. But the way the model works, they have to get registered to start with, and then they have to be audited annually. So many leaders would tell you that they spend, a fair bit of money on ISO. It's relevant to how big the organization is and what kind of products they make. Environmental side, how nasty they are. For example, a personnel agency doesn't impact the environment the same way a steel mill would, obviously. So the larger, more complex, more nasty the companies are, the more it costs them. And I'm sure a lot of leaders wish they didn't have to have the system in place because it costs money. And probably 75 or 80% of them don't actually see a whole lot of value in it other than just getting onto bid lists so they can sell to people. But for the kind of work you do, you could actually show them how they could get a lot more out of their system if they were better communicators and more, let's see, what's the word, more effective leaders. So leadership, as we said earlier, really is the core of a management system. It drives the system. And of course, in your world, you talk a lot about leaders having to walk the talk. So if there are procedures, and many organizations have lots of them, you want to make sure that top management is using them as well, following the procedures, using the nonconformance and corrective action tools rather than just yelling at somebody telling them to fix the problem. So I think your work would certainly show organizations through better leadership how to get more value, more return on investment, if you will, out of their ISO system.
I'm curious since we've gotten to know each other, back in February when we did our first podcast, and I've been, keeping an eye on via LinkedIn, and I know you on your website you've got a lot of content, blogs, and both includes the written content as well as audio or video content. So you're your content is showing up on LinkedIn, which is, again, one of the tools I use. So, and by the way, folks, if you are listening to this podcast, check out Jim Moran on LinkedIn. If you do just a search on SimplifyISO, you'll find his company page. And Jim's just has, I think, weekly, correct me if I'm wrong, but weekly there's a new podcast going up about some topic pertinent to the ISO space.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we just passed the 50 mark.
50?
Yeah, 50 videos up there. Some of them are actual content videos on what is clause 8, what's clause 7, what's clause 6. But once we got past those 7 clauses, the following 40 or so, 45 are just tips on either how to make your system simpler or just management tips in general. There are all kinds of topics in there.
Okay.
Mentioning that.
What issues are still on the table for the company, the leadership team, when it comes to managing a quality system that could be impacted for the better with more effective communication from management from leaders down into the organization? What are some of those issues that companies are facing today, and are there places where leaders how leaders do their work or can result in a more positive outcome?
Yeah, I mentioned I've been around this world since 1992, and in 1996 I saw my first survey of the results of that exact question. What is making you crazy with ISO? And the top 3 things were document control, and back then the systems were very document heavy. Now the second thing was not closing out nonconformances in time, and what that can result in, by the way, Howard, is mistake or problem products getting out to the customer, or a service being delivered improperly without being fixed. Then the third thing was this thing called internal audits, not getting them done on time, or people being stressed out during audits when the registrar comes, that kind of stuff. And that was 1996. 20 years later, actually 30 years later, 20 years later, sorry about my math, BSI did a survey of 250,000 audits. They analyzed 250,000 audits over a 3-year period. They have 80,000 clients, and they looked at the audits for year 1, year 2, year 3, and they found, unbelievably, 20 years later, and with all the automation that's happened and every other darn thing, the top 3 problems are still exactly the same: document control, not closing out nonconformances, and this thing with audits. And I have to say, management plays a pretty big role in this, since they are the core of the system, and a lot of them, through better communication or better leadership style, would probably be more aware of these things that are going on. Some leaders need to inquire about what sorts of radar they have in their company as well. How do they know things are going to either get tipped over to not conforming, or how well are things running? And so it's important that we acknowledge the fact that things haven't changed and things haven't really gotten radically better in any area. So leaders need to take, as I mentioned earlier, need to take responsibility for the effectiveness of the system. That's one of the requirements of the standard. They have to demonstrate leadership and commitment by taking accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. And communication is just such a huge part of that too.
You know, it seems to me that a leader, a manager, can help minimize, alleviate these items, these nonconformances, documentation, closing out incidents, that more effective communication. So having communication go I wouldn't necessarily, it would be nice to say seamlessly down through the organization, but what gets communicated at the leadership level gets communicated down into the organization. We've heard anecdotes over the years of, what I say to you and you say to the person, your neighbor says to their best friend.
Oh, yeah.
That message kind of deteriorates after a bit. That if we can improve the communication and create an opportunity for it to flow down through the organization and back up and improve it overall, then we can, it sounds like what you're saying, reduce those nonconformances and the incidents. And we're going to be more able to, when we have to get recertified every year or whatever, we're more in a position to, it's not as gut-wrenching because, hey, we've got everything, we've got our documentation, we're doing what we said we're going to do. And when the registrar comes in to do a sort of recertification, that it indeed, it happens. It just happens.
Yeah, it all works. It's a really astute point you raised here, and I think lots of top management don't really understand how much they can impact the effectiveness of their management system. And if the management system is effective, they make more money. It's just that simple. Errors cost money. Refixing the same error not only costs money, it begins to start to cost morale, that people get tired of fixing the same problem over and over. And if top management, first of all, isn't aware that it's recurring, and then if top management isn't willing to invest the money it takes to permanently fix it or keep it from recurring, then they haven't really demonstrated leadership, and they haven't really taken responsibility or taken accountability for the effectiveness of the system and the rest of the things that go along with that. I used to teach a college course when I was teaching business at Lambton College and in Sarnia, Ontario. And one of the lines in one of the videos I used to show was, communication is a synonym for life. And I have to say that any organization you go to, if you were to ask them what three things would you want fixed here to make things work better, without fail, one of those three things is always communication, internal communications. And it's been the sort of bane of companies' existence for a long time. And of course, this is not just a particular sector of business. It's in churches, it's in nonprofits, it's in public sector.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. And which brings me to another point. I think I heard you mention ISO or suitable, business suitable for ISO. Virtually any organization in the world could benefit from ISO 9001. It's not a production model. It's a model for how to run a business well. And there's pretty much every classification of business has been ISO certified around the world. I have not heard of a church yet that has been ISO certified. Like, you take a broken soul, put your processes in it, and they'd be fixed. But apart from an actual church, I think just about every classification of business you can imagine has been ISO certified.
It's interesting is I have a new client that I'm working with now. We're rebuilding her LinkedIn profile. She's actually has a faith-based background, who's now becoming a coach specializing in the faith-based communities. And as when we were chatting for the first time last week, she had talked about all the angst that happens as they're called lay leaders inside the church family, is their ability to communicate or inability to communicate can have such an impact. And I think the one word that I would think we could probably package this whole idea around ISO and leadership and communication is culture. What is the culture of the organization you want? What do you want to communicate out to your people, to your customers, to the public about you as an organization, your organization? What do you want to communicate about yourself? And if we don't have those processes, procedures, standards in place where we're striving to do better, then what those problems that have been around since you started in this industry are still going to be there.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too. One of the key pillars of ISO, when I talk about what is it is in general, the three things we usually base it on are: one, customer focus; two, the process approach, meaning everybody takes some kind of input, everybody does a process to it, creates an output. That's the process approach. And third, continual improvement. And if you can improve your management system, you will make more money. For a public service or nonprofit, it would mean you can stay within your budget more easily.
Right.
So improvement really pays. And the other thing is about improvement is that if people who are working with you don't notice something getting better every once in a while, even if it's maintained at a flat-lying level, it's going to feel like it's getting worse. And back to this thing called culture, I actually did a series of 10 called 10 Building Blocks for a Quality Culture. And if you can build quality into the culture, or health and safety, or environmental awareness, or whatever, then it becomes part of how you do business every day. And that's what I love clients of mine to get to the point where nobody ever says, I've done my day's work, now I have to do my ISO stuff. And back in the 80s, 90s, even into the early middle 2000s, that was often heard, that people had built the system in a way, leaders weren't aware of what was being done. Leaders weren't aware that even maybe some of the things that they wanted as leaders were causing extra work that wasn't adding value. So that's another nice thing about it too. The system's completely flexible. It's intended to continually get better. It's intended to add value. It's intended to help people get through their day better with fewer errors and more feeling of satisfaction. Nothing better than getting a job done in any organization and feeling that sort of pride of completion, that kind of thing. And especially if you happen to be in an organization where you might at some point or other see the customer using your product. You definitely see it when it's a service company. You're giving somebody a hairstyle, like that's pretty satisfying. But a lot of times somebody's working on an assembly line making a bearing or something, and they never see it. So there's another thing good leaders will do. Will give people an opportunity to see the products that they're making in action. Maybe even videos from companies.
Most definitely about that. Yes. Jim, I know we've taken up quite a bit of time here, and I really want to thank you once again for sharing your expertise, your years of expertise. And it's just such a fascinating topic. And as I've learned more about ISO, and it just, this connection back to leadership and what it meant was really something I was very interested in. And I think there's certainly in the industries that care about ISO, professional development around leadership, communication, creating quality cultures, there are loads of opportunity. And it just starts with one step, and just figure out what that step needs to be. And Jim, if we have alluded to the LinkedIn site, but if folks want to learn more about you and your work, about ISO, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, thanks, Howard. We have a site, SimplifyISO.com, and it has a tab for these ISO tips. It talks a little bit about our management system cloud-based platform. Anybody who is ISO certified can really benefit from having a look at the platform. I'd be willing to do a demo for anybody pretty much any time. The platform takes care of those three things we talked about. In fact, Bruce Spur and I specifically designed it primarily to address those three specific issues. The document control piece, we've simplified it to the point where it's completely automated, and you can still print pages. The second one was not closing out nonconformances on time, and we have a built-in automated nonconformance system that sends out reminders and even sends them out after the due date's passed. And then the third one is the internal audit issue. So we built some tools inside there to make auditing easier, a simplified checklist, a blank checklist, an automated system to tell you when the audits are due, that kind of thing.
Great, great. So yeah, folks, definitely go out to SimplifyISO.com. Visit Jim Moran's site, and as he had just said, lots of great materials out there. I think he has a checklist that's available too out on the site, so you can opt in to get that.
Yep. 10 ISO tips. There's an ISO tips free download there, and the other thing is the YouTube page. If you just go to YouTube and type in Simplify ISO, there's, I think, 51 or 52 videos there now, and it's growing each week.
That's fantastic. And of course, go out to LinkedIn. You can search for Jim Moran, and his URL ends with SimplifyISO.com. Jim, once again, thank you. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and I'm so appreciative, grateful that you were willing to kind of, I don't know. There's a word I want to use. Is I had a whim, and you were an itch. You were willing to help me understand that. Or I don't want to say necessarily scratch it, but I had this idea, and I just wanted to get your feedback on how leadership and ISO kind of work together. So I appreciate your flexibility and openness to having this discussion with me.
Well, I sure appreciate the chance to reach out to your audience, and hopefully there'll be some feedback, maybe for a future podcast we could do with maybe answering some questions that perhaps could come out of this discussion.
Let's see where it leads. All right, everybody. This is, I think we've gone almost a full hour here. I didn't expect that, but we're somewhat close to that, and you can find us out on the successinsightpodcast.com. You can also check out my website, Howard Fox. It's Fox Coaching Inc. And I'm also on LinkedIn under Fox Coaching Inc. as well. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you again on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.